Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in. In our podcast, we review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and we discuss issues related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA CEUs. Visit our website for other courses, including live courses, webinars, blog posts, and SLP Masterclasses available for graduate level credit. SLP Nerdcast is committed to improving continuing education in our field through affordable pricing and open access libraries. You can support our work by leaving a review, referring a friend, making a one-time contribution on our website, or subscribing. You can subscribe for as low as $7 a month and get access to monthly Q&A sessions, exclusive content, discounts, and a resource library of downloads, freebies, and printables. Want unlimited access to ASHA CEU courses? There's an affordable subscription for that too. For more information, visit us on our website or contact us anytime on Facebook, Instagram, or at info@slpnerdcast.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we can't wait to connect with you.
And just a quick disclaimer, the contents of this episode are not meant to replace clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts, and guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures mentioned during our episodes unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and a fair representation of each topic that we tackle. That being said, it's always likely that there's an article that we've missed or another perspective that we haven't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please email us. We love hearing from our listeners.
This episode is brought to you in part by listeners like you and one of our amazing corporate sponsors, Books. Our corporate sponsors keep our CEU prices low and our program ad-free. Books is a library of animated storybooks and read-along text designed to improve engagement and reading fluency. Kids can track with the highlighted text, and you can pause to go over words and phrases. Join 1 million educators and specialists by trying Books for free for 7 days at books.com. So today we are talking about something very exciting and that I didn't think I was going to be so excited about, if I'm going to be totally honest, until we had a lot of really interesting discussions. We are going to discuss the research to practice gap. And while that might sound sort of dry, we're going to talk about why we should care about it as clinicians, because as it turns out, there are some mind-blowing pieces of information about the research to practice gap. And as clinicians, we know that there is a gap, but what is it? So what is the research to practice gap? And why is it that how does it affect our practice on a regular basis? Amy, as our listeners know, Amy and I are both working clinicians, working on the quote unquote front lines of, in schools and with clients and students and all those kinds of things. And as we prepared for this episode with the two researcher guests that we have on our show today, this really fantastic analogy came up. Amy, do you want to say what it is?
No, I think that you should do it.
So there was this analogy that came up about researchers being in the ivory tower, which of course made us think of.
I would sing it, but I don't know if we're allowed to sing the song.
Why? Because of copyright?
I don't know. Can you sing the
your never-ending story? Yes. So the ivory tower made us think of course, the never-ending story. So meaning to make it parallel to what we're talking about, not to go on a 1980s movie tangent. Researchers in the ivory tower doing their research in this beautiful, clean, pristine situation. And then the information from the research coming down from the ivory tower to us clinicians working on the front lines. And how long does it take the research to come down the ivory tower? What are the barriers that come down? What does that gap actually look like? And for us, Amy and I, as the clinicians, we know that there are a lot of barriers, right? So what of our barriers contribute to the research to practice gap? Is it that we don't have time to read the research? Is it that we have a hard time finding the research that we actually need for a particular student or client? Is it that the research is done in a lab under perfect conditions up in the ivory tower? And we don't really know what's going on in there. It's a super cool club. We don't get invited up there very often, which gives us maybe it gives some people grumpy feelings. I don't know. There's a whole world around this research to practice gap that's really, really important because it affects our clinical practice. And I think something that we've talked about, and Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, we've talked about a lot, is that what happens in a research lab doesn't necessarily represent what's happening in your classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've talked a lot about the evidence-based practice triangle and thinking about that external evidence. And a lot of times you read those articles and you feel like, well, geez, these guys have no idea what my life is down here in internal evidence land. And, I really don't know what it's like up in that ivory tower. And so I think that while we want to integrate this external evidence, it's hard sometimes as a clinician to know what to do with it. Even if you do read something and you're like, okay, it's hard to know how to turn that into something that makes sense for you as a clinician and for your clients. And then, sometimes it's hard to even read the articles if you don't, if you don't subscribe to the journals, which are super duper expensive, like you can't even read that article to have the thoughts about what that might mean for your practice. So there are lots and lots of barriers. And we're here today to learn a bit more about how we can break those down and how we can kind of work together to best serve our clients from people who are in all of these different places, in the swamp or in the ivory tower,
in the swamp of sadness. God, this is the best analogy of all time. So if anybody's listening who hasn't seen that movie, you need to go watch it immediately. But I promise you'll be able to follow along even if you haven't seen it. So, Amy, to sort of piggyback on what you were saying, there are all these hurdles to the research practice gap, and we have some strategies for them. So for those of you who don't know the Informed SLP, the Informed SLP is a platform that produces digestible pieces of summaries of the research that's out there. So we have platforms like that. We have other continuing education platforms. But it's really hard to understand what the research from all the way down here at the bottom in the trenches, underneath the shadow of the ivory tower. It's very hard to sort of see what the research to practice gap is and what variables contribute to it. And it's like Amy said, only after we see the barriers can we really sort of start to do some of the problem solving. So we're not researchers. We can't really solve this problem ourselves. So to get to the bottom of this, we invited two researchers onto the show to answer some of our questions. These are two veteran SLP Nerdcast guests, and we're very excited to have them back. We are very excited to welcome Dr. Kathy Binger and Dr. Natalie Douglas back to the show. Welcome, Kathy and Natalie.
Welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
All right, before we get started, for listeners who haven't joined us on our wonderful adventures with Kathy and Natalie before, can you each tell us just a little bit about yourselves so people can understand why you're here to come talk to us?
Yes, so Natalie here. So I'm actually on the faculty at Central Michigan University right now. I've been here since about 2013. But before that, I had about a 10-year gap where I was providing clinical services, mostly in outpatient, hospital, and long-term care settings. So working as an SLP for about 10 years. And actually, one of the things that most propelled me back into academia was I was hoping that I was going to be able to have some tools to help me solve some of the problems that I was seeing on a day-to-day basis that I didn't think that I could solve with the tools that I had based on my clinical training. So most of my work at this point works on implementing best practices for people with dementia in nursing homes. So I'm really grateful to be here with all of you again today.
How about you, Kathy?
Yeah, I'm Kathy Binger. I'm a professor at the University of New Mexico. And like Natalie, I took the long and winding road back to getting my PhD. I went straight through school to become an SLP thanks to career counseling, found the discipline. But then once I got out and practiced, I initially had thought that I would always get my PhD if I stayed in the field. And then I ended up practicing for about 8 years. In there, I did some research, but mostly I was working clinically during that time. And I worked in lots of different settings. I worked in Head Starts. I've worked in 5 different states. I've worked doing elementary. I worked for elementary school, public schools, middle school for a little bit as well. Even, older populations with developmental disabilities. So worked with different populations, mainly little kids, mostly in public kind of settings. And I got really frustrated. And as I think I knew I would, even way back when I was in school initially. And one of the phrases that kept coming back to me was from a high school teacher who was fond of saying, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So I had one foot out the door from the profession for a lot of those years during that time, and really thought I would leave and go do something else at some point. And then a series of things happened that took me back to school to go back and get my PhD, and with an eye toward really wanting to help solve real world clinical problems. So, and I've been here at UNM for 17 years now.
And I should say, to give credit where it's due, this issue of the research to practice gap is sort of what brought us together. So if we're all being honest, I, with my tail between my legs, got caught on a podcast talking about how one research article in particular was quite boring, and I had to flip to the end. And Amy, of course, laughs. Oh, I love it. We do our little shtick. And lo and behold, it was your research. And on top of it, you had the incredible wherewithal to reach out to me and say, yes, research is boring. Isn't that a problem? And here we are with this beautiful, this issue that sort of brought us together. So kudos to you for not taking offense to my ridiculousness and reaching out across the aisle to try and discuss it and make it better.
Yeah, well, but it's not ridiculousness, right? That's the whole point. And nor are you lowly, nor are you I'd like for you guys to throw out all of those adjectives, because that's not, we need to be peers. We need to be colleagues. We need to work together if we're going to address the problems that we're going to talk about today. So
I love that. And I love it so much that's making me think of 3 or 4 more questions that I want to ask you, but I haven't read our learning objectives yet. So I have to stay focused. Otherwise it's going to be Hot Mess Express from here on out, but we're going to stay focused. Okay. So before we get into this and I ask all the questions you just made me think of, we're going to read our learning objectives. So learning objective number 1, identify at least 2 common approaches to research that contribute to the research to practice gap. Learning objective number 2, identify at least 2 barriers to dissemination of clinically applicable research findings. Learning objective number 3, identify at least 2 strategies within practice-based research that researchers and clinicians can use to close the research to practice gap. Disclosures, Dr. Natalie Douglas, financial disclosures. Dr. Douglas receives a salary from Central Michigan University and the Informed SLP. She also receives book royalties from Plural Publishing and has research funding from the American Speech Language Hearing Foundation. Dr. Douglas's non-financial disclosures. Dr. Douglas is a member of ASHA SIG 2 and SIG 15, the Gerontological Society for America, and the Aphasia Access Group. Dr. Kathy Binger's financial relationships. Dr. Binger is employed by the University of New Mexico. Dr. Binger's non-financial relationships. Dr. Binger is a member of ASHA and Special Interest Group 12. Kate, that's me, financial disclosures. I am the owner and founder of Grand Bois Therapy and Consulting, LLC, and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures, I'm a member of ASHA SIG 12 and serve on the AAC Advisory Group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, Mass ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group. Amy Wonka's financial disclosures. Amy is an employee of a public school system and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Amy's non-financial disclosures. Amy is a member of ASHA SIG 12 and serves on the AAC Advisory Group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. Okay, that was very, very long and boring, and I'm sorry I had to read it. ASHA makes me do it. So now getting on to the good stuff. Something that you said right before we got through that long and boring piece brought me to a question, and I wondered if before I have some general questions about what it's like to do research. So what goes on in the ivory tower, but I wondered if from your perspective as researchers, because we have such different workplace settings, right? We have such different jobs. I mean, even though they influence one another, or they should influence one another more, do you feel that there is a great divide, let's call it, between the researching world and the clinical world?
Yes, there is a big one. And I just want to reiterate what Kathy said. It was actually making my stomach hurt when you guys were talking about.
I saw you cringe.
Tower and
I was going to text you later and apologize. I wanted to make sure your feelings weren't hurt, but I think it's real.
it is so real, but I find it so heartbreaking. It makes me so sad that we as, we have to be part of the solution here. And to think of my colleagues thinking of themselves in that way makes me it just points to such systemic issues that we have to get out ahead of, and I think, I don't know what happened along the way systemically that has made the research world and the clinical world, especially in a field like speech language pathology, where, clinical research questions from a research and a clinician perspective, those guide what we do. And so it's incredible to me that with such a common foundational principle of improving life for people with communication disorders, how things have gotten so siloed.
I love the way you put that. I love the way you put that.
I wonder how much of it, or if at least there's a piece of it that's shame related. We talked about this a little bit the last time we were on, and Amy, I think you mentioned something in an email about this recently, about just, how researchers / professors / can say things to clinicians about, well, you really should be reading the research literature more, or, that sort of thing, that there's this shaming element to it. What do you guys think about that?
I definitely think so. And it was a conversation that I had with a PhD level speech pathologist that I was collaborating with. And she said, well, SLPs just don't read the research. And I went, whoa, well, that was a vast generalization. There are a lot of barriers to being a working clinician. And I also think there's a component of prestige. So it is more school. It's a lot more of a commitment. It's a lot more money and time, or time money, as Amy always says, one and the same. And, as a working clinician, a lot of us, what would it be like to have our name in print? It would be so cool. There is this level of prestige that it is a higher, more important job.
I think too, for a lot of us, prior to this, my interactions with people who were researchers or faculty was in a power differential dynamic, such that I was there paying to learn from this person who knew more and was essentially, my superior in content. So I think that a lot of us who haven't gone forward, into kind of the next step, is kind of do view it as like a next step. If you're really serious, you go on and you do research, or, you get your doctorate. We still also carry that piece with us, where that was the nature of our relationship. I mean, even now I have professors who have told me a million times, you can just call me Shelley. And I'm like, no, I can't actually. That is just not how your brain is how your name is coded in my brain, So I think that's probably a piece of it too. And as somebody who works in the school, I think depending on your work environment, there's also even sort of cultural differences and judgments that, I think it's pretty common. Kate and I met in outpatient. So I think we've both worked there. So we can speak a little bit to sometimes what happens as outpatient is you think that you're better than everybody who works in the schools, So there's a lot of differences that we can, depending on the culture of our work environment, that we may internalize or externalize, that may or may not be true at all. Through this, I've talked to a lot of people who are in my mind pretty fancy people, and everybody's been lovely and generous and shared, information. So I think some of this is also constructs that we build ourselves. And so that's something else for the clinician to be aware of. If there's a paper you want to read, email the author. They might just share it with you.
Oh my God, every single author I have called through this project, I have cold contacted 10,000 million people. It's not even a number. It was a lot. every single researcher I've contacted is thrilled to hear from me. I can't believe you read my paper. I'm so happy to hear, and they want to talk about it. So I think, Amy, you're right. A lot of this divide, or the height of the ivory tower, to continue with this analogy, is fictitious. It's not really there, but it is part of a construct that we've either perceived or created.
And there are like institutional barriers too, which we're going to talk about more now.
Yes.
Through the rest of this podcast. But I think at least a piece of it is what we carry in our own brains. And we maybe need to challenge that a little bit, all of us, regardless of your work environment.
And I think that this is, the whole, point of this episode is really to untangle the complexity of the research to practice gap and identify these barriers and suggest some strategies. And this is one of them, this perceived distance or prestige or, unreachableness and exclusive clubness of the research world. I think another piece of it is not really having a good understanding of what researchers do. So not all you guys were both clinicians. So you were working clinicians before you were researchers. So you have visibility. I won't say the swamp of sadness. I will say the beautiful field in which we frolic with our clients and students. Does that make you feel better, Natalie?
Much. Okay. It's a much better visual thing.
Okay, there you go. So with Atreyu, riding the horse Atreyu through the beautiful field of flowers. So what we don't really, but as clinicians, we don't really know what goes on in the ivory tower. So can you tell us a little bit about what shapes your job as a researcher? So when you're doing the research, are you thinking about the working clinicians, or are you really tackling a million other logistics like grant writing and staffing? Like, we don't really know what goes into your work as your daily lives as a researcher.
Natalie, you want to take that first, or you want me to take a shot at that?
I will take it indirectly because I think it really is a fascinating question. And it gets back to what you were saying in terms of creating constructs in our minds that serve as barriers. So one example would be, I don't work at a research intensive institution. I still do research. But as you were asking that question, I was like, well, I can't answer that. And, people at Research One institutions, they can answer that. And, just so you know, I mean, even within academia and within institutions, there are all kinds of situations, just like what you mentioned, where it's like, well, here I am at Central Michigan University, and I love my institution, but it's not a Research One institution. And so
I don't even know what a Research One institution is.
There's
What's
a whole
that?
Carnegie. It's called the Carnegie Rankings. Every university is ranked in terms of its level of research intensivity. That's not a word, but it'll work.
That's okay. We can make it.
Yeah. And even within that, even if you are like University of New Mexico is it's an R1, called research intensive university. And it dictates things like, what's your course load? How many courses do you teach each semester or each year? So a university like Natalie's, in all likelihood, she's probably going to teach more classes a year than I am. Whereas my output in terms of a researcher, there are a higher level expectations for the amount of output that I have as a researcher. So there's a whole construct within all of that. And even at the R1 level, UNM is not thought of as a whatever, I could list them, but I won't, other universities that are seen as more prestigious than a university like UNM. So even within we're constantly, it's a thing that we do as people, is we're just constantly figuring out where we are in the social hierarchy. And we often do ourselves no favors with that, I think.
So well put. So let's get into some of those details. So you're at an institution that designates X percent of your working life to research versus clinical versus instruction. How long does it take you? So here we are in the beautiful fields, the researchers at the beautiful fields at the bottom of the ivory tower. You guys you think up some clinical question, or you're peering out at us through the windows of the tower. Like, oh, that looks like a problem. I have a clinical question. How long does it take you to do the research? Like what isn't, because that's got to be part of the research gap, practice gap problem.
Or even like, what is the action? Like, what are your action steps? You see Kate,
so
you see her problem.
Yeah. So let's start. How about they're two very different questions. Well, they're two highly related questions, but Natalie, let's just start with the big figures. So you start with that, and then we can talk about like answering some of those other questions.
Sure. So there was a kind of review of mental health and education literature that was published several years ago, but you'll see the statistic kind of being flouted about. I don't know if flouted is a word either.
We're making up words today. Roll with it.
We're making up
Bandied. How about bandied? Bandied about?
But essentially saying that it takes 14 years for 17% of research to reach routine clinical practice.
Or was it 17 years and 14%? One or the other. I'll look it up while we're chatting. Either way, it's too long.
It's a teen. It's a teen, and that's a lot longer than one would think.
That's a lot longer than it should be.
That's insane. I mean, regardless of how those numbers. So
right.
Basically that means that if you're a clinician working, the research that's happening right now in the lab down the street isn't going to be implemented for between 14 and 17 years.
Right. Like less than a quarter of that research as well. Right. So like less than 25% of that research.
That's insane.
What about all the other percent? What happens to that research?
It's in journals that are expensive
Yeah.
and behind paywalls.
That's right.
But might have helped you get promoted.
Oh my God.
Probably
Okay.
did. Yeah.
This is just problems on problems. Okay. So I'm in the grassy field with my clinical problems, right? You guys are up in the ivory tower that's getting shorter as we talk about this because there's really no tower. We've made it up. Okay.
And God knows there's no ivory, which is a good thing too.
Right. Exactly. It's dingy.
That's
it's
true.
Whitewashed. So you see the clinical problem, you try to solve it by asking the clinical question, and you probably have grant funding. And there's no guarantee that the answers that you get from your research are going to be actually disseminated and implemented by the clinicians. And even if it does, it's going to take 14 to 17 years.
Yeah, no, I think the figure was 17. Not that that's accurate to begin with, but yeah.
That's bonkers.
Yeah.
So I have to assume that 17-year gap for you guys, you see the clinical problem, you ask the clinical question, but like Amy said, what are your action steps? Like you have to procure funding, write grants, find a co-author? Like, what are you doing? What's happening in there?
What's wrong with us? Is the question.
That's not how I meant it.
Where are
what is going on in there, guys?
People? Yeah. So as Natalie was saying, it looks somewhat different depending on the research institution that you're at, the what kind of research you're doing. Let's just focus, to make this simple, we're just going to focus on clinical practice research, which is its own thing, and is a minority of the articles that get published are actual clinical practice research, right? There's a lot of theoretically driven research, which is not, which is important as well, and can and should change how we go about thinking about go ahead, Kate.
I don't even know can you explain the difference between theoretical research and what was it?
Clinical practice research.
Clinical practice research.
The goal of clinical practice research ultimately from its inception is to learn things about and change clinical practice. It's really focused on clinical practice. But let's say, for example, in my world, I have questions about how children go about learning language, right? Typically developing children or children who speak different languages. Maybe I'm a linguist and I want to know, how does language work in this branch of languages versus that branch of languages? What are the common themes that run across language learning, regardless of what language a child is learning? There are pieces of things in there that can ultimately inform clinical practice, but it's a long way from studying, languages X, Y, and Z, and looking from a linguistics perspective to see what's similar and what's different, to changing how am I dealing with teaching language to a child with autism who's sitting right here in front of me, right? So that's more theoretical research, but there may be pieces in there that eventually could inform clinical practice. Natalie?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out for a little bit more context. So Megan Roberts and colleagues in 2020, they published an article where over an 11-year period, so from 2008 to 2018, they reviewed articles from all the ASHA journals. So that would be like AJSLP, JSLHR, the Audiology Journal, and the Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in the Schools. And they had certain criteria, but they ended up with 2,483 articles, and only 25% of them were clinical practice research, meaning that the large majority of what's published in the ASHA journals does not meet that criteria that Kathy was talking about in terms of being relevant to clinical practice.
Directly relevant to clinical practice. Kate, you're gonna faint, I think.
She's got a serious expression going on.
That's insane to me. So basically, there are some, I'm making the assumption that there are some, constructs in the research world through funding or different kinds of, I don't know, incentive or interest, where researchers are publishing research that just sits in the fancy, expensive journals and maybe gets you promoted or whatever you said before. Is that a fair assumption based on those numbers? Or have I misunderstood that completely?
Well, there are lots of people who are interested. I don't know about lots, that might be an overstatement, but people within a discipline and a sub-discipline are interested in learning about these things, like are interested in knowing how things work and the underlying mechanisms and all that kind of stuff. Like there are lots of threads and pieces that go into, let me say, if I'm going to develop an intervention, I'm going to look not just at what is it that has been already proven to work, but I'm going to look at what do we know about language development that might be useful for me to feed into this intervention. And so it's not, I don't want to leave the impression that 75% of the work is garbage and we shouldn't be doing it anymore. But It's not directly, it can and should in various ways inform what we do, but it's a long and winding road, and that's not enough. Like, I think Natalie and I are both, happy to be forthright and say, and that's not where we live. That's not where she and I want to live as researchers. We want to live more in the world of, okay, let's get to the direct clinical practice. Let's get to finding ways to help change immediate practice. But that's the system in which we work and live, is this 75-25% split that's happening.
That is wild. I am shocked
Natalie,
to hear this.
To add?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think to a certain degree, we can both and this to a degree, right? So we need basic science, we need fundamentals, we need mechanistic type work. We need that work. It needs to be done, but I think what we want to hopefully call attention to, as Kathy said, is this system has a lot of barriers, and so from the clinician's perspective, I don't know what we'll end up titling this episode, but another title might be, evidence-based practice gap. It's not your fault, as a
I love that.
That's right. Too. That's right.
There's a colon in there, by the way.
So many, there's layer upon layer, and we need that basic science, but we also need work that's going to systematically, because the other problem is that of that 25% of clinically applicable research, and that's probably even a high estimate, we don't know that that's changing human behavior, right? That even that 25% is getting into where it needs to be.
Right, I was just thinking about that. So, Amy and I are very familiar with the barriers on our end at the, in the field. But that's astounding. I mean, I have a colleague who's working in a school who has a caseload of 140. She's not reading research in her spare time. She's crying in a dark closet, trying to figure out when she's going to do all her paperwork, right?
I also can't have Kate say this without saying, advocate for reasonable working conditions, people. This is something that we need to do for our clients.
So we have a massive amount of barriers, aside from, and I made a list here while we were preparing for this. So we have time and workload and caseload issues. We maybe don't necessarily think it's that interesting. So this is what Kathy, you caught me doing, flipping to the last page, like, I'm not really interested in the statistics. What can I take away from this and use it in my, using my job? There's a lot of research is heavy with jargon and math that, yes, I took research methods. I took it more than the average bear because I had a second, certificate educational training as a BCBA. So I've taken more of it than most people. And I haven't used it in 10 years. It's not something that's fluent to me. So I'm really overwhelmed by it. And I'm not going to spend the extra time trying to really digest it from a mathematical, research perspective. The article, I was dying to find this one article recently in preparing for an episode behind a paywall, had to pay the journal $300 some to get access to it, which is absurd. I might be looking for an article for a student or client that's not even well represented in the research that I'm reading. So then I'm trying to think about, other ways to implement the treatment that I want to do in a way that is congruent with the external evidence, but also with internal evidence and my own data collection. And, we consume a lot of research as part of this podcast. And sometimes it can be really hard, even being more closer to it than the average bears, I guess, women bears. It can be hard to sort of quickly and easily translate that into clinical implementation. So here we are in the clinical field with all of these barriers. And now you're telling me that in the ivory tower, where there are all of these additional barriers, guys, this is nuts. This is a huge problem.
It is, and it's not an insurmountable problem. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to belittle any of that. And as we talked about a bit the last time we were on the podcast, the research articles, I'm talking about peer-reviewed research articles that are in, true, solid research journals. They're not written for clinicians. They're written to meet criteria of research rigor, right? They have to be conducted in a rigorous manner. Now, what that rigor looks like is going to vary depending on the kind of study you're doing, right? What rigor looks like for a focus group study or a survey is very different. And those two things are very different from conducting an intervention study, right? All of those things, but the rigor needs to be there so that you can have faith in the findings. Then what needs to happen is not rewarded in our jobs in the way that, in terms of getting promotion and tenure and that kind of thing, is then finding ways to more effectively disseminate those findings in all the different ways that we could do that, whether it's, social media outlets and other online outlets and clinical newsletters and all that stuff. So it depends on where your job is, how much those things are valued as a researcher and how intensive of a research institution you're working at, how much credit you get for doing that kind of work. So yeah, there's all of that. But do you want to talk a little bit about what some of that day-to-day stuff is like how do we go about planning research projects and what kinds of things are involved?
Yeah, because I think it would be helpful as a clinician. I want to be able to read your research, and I have read your research, and take stuff away from it and trust it and say okay, they found that this worked. So there's at least a somewhat reasonable likelihood that this might work or elements of this might work for my client. I'm going to try it and feel more confident about doing that than I saw this worksheet that my friend used. She liked it. I'm going to try that worksheet. Right. Yeah. So what are you thinking about in doing that make me better able to trust what your information is telling me?
I think that's such an interesting question. And I think it really depends on what the question is, right? And so I can just kind of walk you through a little bit of what, for as like a timeline of kind of how things have went. So part of why I went back to school was because, especially in the nursing home setting, I felt so extremely overwhelmed with not being able to provide people with what I thought were evidence-based practices, right? So that was like a major problem I had in my mind. And so my first kind of published study along that line was my dissertation study, where we looked at whether or not clinicians were able to implement external memory aids for people with dementia in nursing homes. So as the beginning step, the question that we asked was essentially, are you able to implement external memory aids for people with dementia? So this was a survey-based study. This was in the state of Florida. And we basically found out that no, we can't. And so an additional part of that study was to look at barriers and facilitators as to why. So then we asked, well, why can't you? And people would say, very similar to what you have said, time. They said there's not productivity standards. We might train the nursing assistant on how to use the external memory aid, and then they don't do it. So then we published that study. And then my next study after that was, well, we better talk to certified nursing assistants and kind of see their perspectives on this. And they actually said the opposite. So nursing assistants actually said, we would be happy to implement this therapy tool for people with dementia, but no one has ever trained us. And so that was their perspective and perception. So it's like the SLP was like, we train the CNA, they don't do it. The CNA was like, what? We would love to do it, but no one's training us. So there's kind of like, and so just between those two studies, I think was 5 years, which seems, I know that seems really wild, but like, are you asking the right questions? And, and then, during that time, I was working on designing kind of a collaborative coaching program between an SLP and a nursing assistant and a person with dementia. So we did like a pilot program to look at outcomes. And then that was published, but that was like another 3 years. And then even like right now, the next step is to try to see if that little program, can be kind of scaled up, and we're looking at 6 nursing homes now. So basically you have from, 2009 to now, we're like halfway through 2021. And there's a chance that we might have found something that hopefully addresses the barriers identified at the level of the SLP and the nursing assistant to improve communication for people with dementia. But that was, like a 10-year gap, and we're still kind of gathering data on that. And as we talked about earlier, I do have an element of research expectation, but I don't, my next step would be to apply for federal funding. All of my funding at this point has been foundation level funding. But there are people who, have to, in academia, that they have to have that level of federal funding or else they don't get to keep their position. And those are kind of more on a 5-year cycle. And that kind of follows Kathy's trajectory, I think, a little bit more.
Well, and that whole process that you just described, first of all, that's a long time, right? That's definitely a contributing factor. But something that you said made me think of the part of the solution piece is, and I guess it's barrier and solution, is this concept of dissemination. So, as you're planning as the researcher moving forward with the, the research rigor and making sure that it, meets certain standards and moving the ball forward to answer your clinical question, thinking about the last stop on the train is getting the information out there, right? It's disseminating all that information. And I wonder if either of you could talk quickly about what, in terms of bridging this gap, it's not your fault, or whatever the title of this is going to be. There are things that I'm sure that we as clinicians can do, and we can talk about that. But what are the things that researchers, given all of those barriers, can do, or what are the, I'm sure it's different in every work setting depending on what kind of university you're in, but what is that last stop in the train, train line, the dissemination station? What does that look like for you guys?
So there's an element of that. So, again, depending on the university that you're at, and what the expectations are, if you're looking at it more from a job-driven kind of perspective, the peer-reviewed publication is usually the gold standard, right? Like that you have conducted rigorous research and that you have completed your research project or components of it, and you are publishing the results of that in a respected peer-reviewed journal or journals. So that's really what counts in terms of promotion and tenure, especially at the higher level research institutions, right? Now that's purely from a job perspective. Now, if you look at it from a who we are as people perspective, I think, most folks who do what we do certainly want to be informing clinical practice. Like, we got into this because we want to be helping to change and improve clinical practice. So then there are those other components too of for example, publishing things in places like this, the SIG newsletters, and which are often, more accessible, maybe more widely read, certainly by frontline clinicians, other kinds of clinical newsletters. So that's still a reading sort of activity. And then there's more and more focus on various social media avenues and that sort of thing. And I think we're going to be seeing a whole lot more of that. There's also a whole science to dissemination that Natalie can talk about, and she knows more about that than I do. So Natalie, you want to add to that?
Well, it's interesting that you said that, because as I sit here and reflect on this, I think for Kathy and I, who have kind of been in this world, trying to be part of the solution, we see a peer-reviewed publication as the starting line, right? Like, whereas I think in traditional academic settings, that's your finish line, right? But to, when we're thinking about dissemination, and implementation, a peer-reviewed publication is really only the beginning, right? And so I think part of what we've hit on a lot of these issues in terms of dissemination, but, we know that passive methods of dissemination do not change behavior. And we've seen that time and time again. So even if you're getting something into, perspectives or like a SIG journal, a special interest group journal, it's very unlikely that that's going to change your behavior. So what we need is to look at our audience a little bit more closely. And I think that's where there's multiple empirical questions that we could ask. So we could ask, for one, where are SLPs in these settings where we want the research to go? How do they want to get information, right? So what are their preferences and where are they already going? If we look at some other fields, we might know that peers are a really popular place to get information, and that can be really good, that can be not so good. We know social media is another one, but I think as researchers, the more that we can get to know the audience, right, and figure out patterns in terms of not just at the individual clinician level, but what's a typical day, right? What is the organizational context where these services are being provided? Because unless you're in a private practice, your services are not being provided in a vacuum, but within another system, right? And there's all the constraints at the level of the organization. So in terms of dissemination, I definitely think, as we have talked about as much as we can have more open science, and I think CSD Disseminate is a volunteer organization that they're encouraging authors to provide preprints so that there's less of the paywall. So I think that and a movement towards open science is really part of it. But I think we need to take a more active approach. And even before we're studying, before we're answering our research questions, asking clinicians what they need. What are the problems? What do you see as solutions? And really collaborating up front. So there's a term, it's a phrase that the University of Wisconsin-Madison, they did a training on it, but it's designing for dissemination. And it was like D4D, right? Where it's like, if we want to have if we want the information to go where it needs to go, we got to be engaging people actively from the beginning and encourage that participation.
Well, and I think as someone who's read, I work in a very narrow kind of lane of the field. So there are researchers whose research I tend to read. And so if I see that something has come out by an author, I will read it. And I have noticed that same thing that you were kind of talking about earlier, Natalie, where okay, so this is a study, but then the next paper they publish is kind of connected to that study, but a little bit different. And, I wonder too, as a clinician, even if you guys feel like Natalie, in your example, you're trying to answer a bigger question, but for me, it's helpful maybe even to have some of that information before it's super duper proven, because you're still doing more controlling for those variables, and you're still looking at it with a much finer lens than I'm able to do in my just clinical practice level. And I guess this isn't really, it's not even a question. It's just a thought that it would be cool if there was a way for us to kind of promote a bit of dialogue around some of this in-process research. And maybe thinking about, Kathy, you had said that peer-reviewed, journal is sort of the starting point. I wonder if maybe there could be a parallel path that's sort of happening at the same time. I don't know. It's very interesting to think about how many parts go into what you guys are doing in terms of your research, but the time is long.
And so, go ahead.
No, so I was going to come back to in terms of our strategies, we've talked about reaching out to people. We've talked about not living inside of your construct that you've built for yourself. What else? What else are we? You guys are making changes at the institutional level in terms of the types of research that you're conducting.
Yeah, that's one of the initial questions that Kate had asked was, at what point in the process do you think about the endpoint? Who's the clinician? And the answer is, well, it depends on the kind of research that you're doing. But for research like the kind of research that Natalie and I do, that's day one. We're both trying to think about what's going on at the clinical endpoint at the very start of what we're doing. Otherwise, what we get to at the end isn't going to be clinically relevant. And we're getting better at, and Natalie's making a career out of, doing exactly that from the very beginning, of being, getting input from clinicians before we collect data, before we, again, not this old-fashioned style of top-down approach where, oh, I'm sitting in the ivory tower and I have a great idea and I'm going to go get this sucker funded and go spend at least the next 5 years of my life working on this, and shouldn't you all be grateful? But more, hey, we're all in this together. We want to make sure what we're doing is ultimately having an impact on clinical practice. Let's talk with clinicians from the very beginning of the conceptualization stages and build our research that way, and build our research hopefully collaboratively, et cetera. And, I'm newer, as much as that sort of approach has always been in my head. In reality, I'm newer to that approach. Natalie's really started off with that approach. And it's really, I'm never going to do research the same way again. I shouldn't say never, there's still components of projects that we have where it's still really valuable to do certain things that are at that other, not higher, just different level of research that's more, maybe somewhat more theoretical. Like I'll give you a hard and fast example as quickly as I can. We're working on some measurement work right now. We don't really have in the AAC world, when children are using picture symbols to communicate, we do not have valid, reliable, developmentally sensitive, and socially valid measures for tracking progress. And so we're in the initial stages of working on developing all of that. Now, is that going to have an impact tomorrow on your clinical practice? No. But it can have a long-term impact on how everybody is, measuring things along the way. Maybe it's going to be primarily more researchers, but maybe it'll be clinically too. But that work still has to get done. There needs to be some input from clinicians on all of that, but it's a little bit different from doing an intervention project, right? But if I'm doing an intervention project and developing interventions, then that's the kind of project where from now on, I need to be tapped in from the get-go with, depending on who my audience is, parents, teachers, educational assistants, what have you, along the way. So there's still room for both, but we really want to be focused with certain projects with getting input from the very beginning from clinicians, et cetera, clinicians, families, et cetera.
While you were talking, it was making me think of, thinking of myself as a younger also, but greener clinician, and where I got my information. And I think one thing from a clinician's perspective that is, if anybody, assuming that there are clinicians listening, is making sure that we're being wise consumers of information. There are a lot of barriers to reading research as we've discussed. And I think the social component, like you said, a lot of people get their information from peers. And I don't know if it's the invention of social media that is different from when I was first practicing, but there is so much misinformation out there about, or twisted information or diluted information. I think we need to be, as clinicians and people who are working in the field of science, need to be informed consumers of the information that we see and skeptical of the information that we see. And then combine that with other sources of easily consumable information. I mean, I think, if you guys are branching out with implementation science and all of these things that you're doing in the ivory tower, that's not so big and it's not so white, your other parallel field, I'll call it that, over a bridge, maybe that's a little more like friendly. If you're building a bridge from one side, I feel like there are things that we can do from the other side as well. Amy, I don't know if you have any other brilliant thoughts of brilliance that you always do.
No, I think you oversell me. You're overselling me. No, I think that, I think that it's helpful as a clinician to know that there are all of these different pieces that are involved in research, and to know there actually formally are different types of research. And we do still want you guys to be doing all of those types. I want to know about typical language development. I want to know all of that information because that should also inform my practice as well. And, in speaking with both of you, I think that having that awareness and maybe feeling a bit more comfortable being able to reach out and have those conversations is like an actionable step that everybody can sort of take right now.
I think, we've covered a lot in this episode. I think everything from examining our own internal biases and our thoughts and feelings that we might have about relationships about the research to practice gap, realizing that we're all part of organizations and systems that have implicit biases and constructs that are barriers that we may or may not be able to control. And I think honestly, knowing that there are researchers out there like you guys who are doing this great work in trying to, first of all, who are willing to talk about have these difficult conversations about bias and do it with a little bit of laughter on top of it. And acknowledging that this is a problem, because you can't fix it if you don't know that it's there, right? And doing that kind of research that tries to build that bridge and extend it is such a critical piece. So thank you so much for everything that you do. We're very grateful that you are willing to come on here and talk about these kinds of things, that you're doing the kind of research that you're doing. And I hope that everybody listening has acquired some appreciation for what it is to be a researcher and all the barriers that you all face, and knowing that there are a lot of people who are working to close the research to practice gap to the best of our abilities, given the different barriers that we face in our setting. So thank you again for coming on and sharing all of your wisdom with us. Do you have anything to say, Amy?
It's not an ivory tower. It turns out it's just been two fields all along. It's just two fields
connected by a
right
bridge.
Across a bridge.
That's right.
We're going to have to
Thank you so much.
Get like a cartoon or something drawn of this at some point. Yeah. So if you're still with us and you would like to use this episode for ASHA CEUs, you can do so at our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. If you have something to add to the conversation, you can email us anytime at info@slpnerdcast.com. If you feel so inclined, please feel free to leave us a review on your podcast player. We love hearing from our listeners. And that pretty much wraps us up for today. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
And we hope everybody learned something.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon. Another big thank you to our corporate sponsors, Vooks, who helped to make this episode possible. Our corporate sponsors keep our CEU prices low and our program ad-free. Vooks is a library of animated storybooks with read-along text designed to improve engagement and reading fluency. Kids can track with the highlighted text, and you can pause to go over words and phrases. Join 1 million educators and specialists by trying Vooks for free for 7 days at Vooks.com.